The Wild West is known for its lawlessness, gunfights, outlaws, and lawmen. Murder was common in the Wild West, but the family we are covering today took it to a whole nother level. The Bloody Bender family. In 1803, America purchased 530 million acres of land from France. It was known as the Louisiana Purchase. France had controlled the land since 1682, but France had lost interest in expanding its empire across North America. Plus, it needed the money to fight the British, who had declared war on them earlier that year. America bought the land for $15 million. That is around $330 million in modern money with inflation. The land stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to over the Canadian border, 828,000 square miles of land. Arkansas, Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Minnesota, Louisiana, New Mexico, Texas, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, and Colorado were all part of the land bought under the Louisiana Purchase. In 1848, gold was found at Sutter's Mill in California. This discovery sparked one of the greatest migrations in history. Hundreds of thousands of people traveled west to California to try to strike it rich and start a new life. New territories and states began to spring up across the West, one of those being Kansas. Before the American Civil War erupted, fighting started in Kansas. The fighting was over whether or not Kansas would become a slave state or a free state. The state would have two separate capitals and constitutions. John Brown famously crossed into Kansas with his sons to fight to make Kansas a free state, and many pro-slavery supporters from Missouri, known as border ruffians, crossed into Kansas to fight for slavery. There were political killings, riots, election fraud, murders, assaults. The event was known as Bleeding Kansas. The Free Staters would eventually win Kansas. It would become a free state on January 29, 1861. After the American Civil War, people continued to move west, and fighting shifted onto the Native American populations. After the government opened land in the Western Territories for homesteading, many families moved to Kansas to claim land and start their new lives. In October of 1870, John Bender Jr. and John Bender arrived in northwestern Lebec County. They were interested in purchasing land. They eventually bought 160 acres next to the Great Osage Trail. Very little is known about the family's origins, but it's believed that they were spiritualists, which was popular in the 19th century. Spiritualists believe that a person's soul continued even after death, and that spirits can communicate with the living. Mary Todd Lincoln was one of the most famous believers in spiritualism. It is unknown why the family chose Kansas. The father, John Bender, was around 60 years old. He spoke little English. It's believed he was German or Dutch. He would be known as Pa Bender. This is how a neighbor described him. The old man was a repulsive, hideous brute, without a redeeming trait. Dirty, profane, and ill-tempered. The son, John Bender Jr., was around 25. He was described as handsome, with brown hair and a mustache. He was tall and thin. He spoke with a German accent, but spoke fluent English. Many believed that he was dim-witted. He would laugh at almost nothing. The two men built a cabin. It was 16 by 24 feet. A small 6-foot cellar was dug under the cabin. It was built along the Great Osage Trail. A barn was built and a well was dug. In the fall of 1871, the family's other half arrived in Kansas. The mother, Elvira Bender, was in her mid-50s. She would become known as Ma Bender. Her neighbors described her as a she-devil, since she had an unfriendly attitude. She spoke little English. Old Miss Bender was a dirty old Dutch crone. her face was a fit picture of the midnight hag that wove the spell murderous ambition about the soul of Macbeth. And the daughter, Kate Bender, was around 23 years old. She was described as a beautiful woman who spoke perfect English with little to no accent. John Jr. and Kate were introduced as brother and sister, but many believe that this was a ruse. They were actually common-law husband and wife. The Benders used a canvas wagon cover to turn their small cabin into a two-room cabin, with a kitchen and dining room table out front. A large orchard was dug around back. Pa Bender put up a sign in front of the cabin that said grocery, but it was misspelled, Grocry. Once Kate and Elvira arrived, it was replaced with a sign spelled correctly this time, groceries. Kate presented herself as a spiritualist and claimed to have psychic abilities. She advertised herself as a healer who could cure illnesses and speak to the dead. She also conducted seances at the inn. Kate's good looks and psychic abilities drew in people to visit the Benders' cabin. The Great Osage Trail was a main route for travelers headed further west or headed back east. Travelers could stop in and get a warm meal and a place to sleep for the night. Many of the people that stopped at the Benders' cabin for the night were alone. They were headed west, so they did not know anybody in the area. Eventually, people who had stopped at the Benders' Inn began to go missing. But murder was the last thing on people's minds. The West was a dangerous place. There were attacks from Native Americans. Poisonous snakes, wolves, and coyotes roamed the area. Bandits and outlaws were also hiding out. The road west was a dangerous place, and the Benders claimed that the missing guest had left the inn and continued on their way. There was little suspicion around the Benders at this time. In May of 1871, a man was found in nearby Drum Creek with his throat slit and his head crushed. The property owner was blamed for the murder, but no arrest was made. In 1872, 2 more men were found with these same injuries. There had been many reports of missing people in the area. They had passed through and stayed at the Benders' Inn, and never arrived at their destination. People began going a different route, thinking that the bandits were killing travelers on the Great Osage Trail. George Newton Longcore was a Civil War veteran who lived in Independence, Kansas, a popular stepping-off point headed out west. In December 1872, after his wife died, he decided to move to Iowa for a fresh start with his infant daughter, Mary Ann. But George and Mary Ann never reached Iowa. They vanished along the Great Osage Trail, or so they thought. George and Mary Ann's old neighbor, Dr. William York, eventually learned of their disappearance, and he decided to look for them. He traveled the route that they intended to take. He questioned people along the way, and he made it to Fort Scott, Kansas. After he failed to find George and Mary Ann, he returned to Independence, Missouri on March 9, 1873, but he never arrived. Dr. York had 2 brothers who knew he was traveling along the route, trying to find the missing family, Ed York from Fort Scott and Colonel Alexander York. They both began searching for their missing brother. Colonel York set off with 50 men for the search. They stopped every traveler on the way and stopped at every homestead. He questioned them all about the disappearance of his brother. He was supposedly very aggressive and suspicious of everyone that he questioned. On March 28th, he reached the Bender Inn and explained that his brother went missing and he was searching for any information. The Benders admitted that Dr. York had stayed with them, but tried to convince the colonel that he probably ran into unfriendly Indians on the trail. Colonel York agreed that this could have happened. He stayed for dinner before continuing on his way. He stopped at a nearby homestead owned by the Roaches. He left feeling like they were involved in his brother's death. On April 3rd, Colonel York returned with his group of men after learning a woman had escaped from the Bender Inn after being threatened with a knife by Elmira Bender. John Jr. and Mary both denied the claims. Elmira claimed that the woman was a witch who cursed their coffee. She then told the men to leave. She had previously claimed not to speak English, but spoke it very clear during this confrontation. Mary went up to the colonel and asked him to return alone so that she could use her abilities to find his brother, but the colonel declined. Colonel York was convinced that the Benders had murdered his brother, but he needed to find more evidence. A few weeks later, a community meeting was arranged. Numerous people had gone missing from the Osage Trail, and people were convinced that someone nearby was responsible. Colonel York was at the meeting, and it is believed that John Jr. and Pa Bender both could have been at the meeting that day. It was agreed that every homestead between Big Hill Creek and Drum Creek would be searched for the missing travelers. After Colonel York's visit to the Bender Inn, the family decided to flee the area. 3 days after the town meeting, a farmer named Billy Toll was moving his cattle past the Bender Inn when he noticed that the inn looked unkept and the farm animals had no food or water, and some had even died of malnutrition or from thirst. He fed and watered the animals, and then he reported this all to the township. It took days before anybody could reach the Bender Inn. When they finally arrived to search the inn, they noticed immediately that there were no possessions inside, no clothing or food. They immediately noticed a horrible smell coming up from the floor. They found a trap door in the floor that had been nailed shut. A bed covered the door. The horrible smell was coming up from this trap door. They opened the door and found clotted blood all over the floor in the cellar, which was 6 feet deep. It had a slab of rock at the bottom, which the cabin had been built on. The men used sledgehammers and broke up the floor. They were able to dig around but were unable to find any bodies. They believed that the smell was coming from blood that had soaked through the floor and into the ground. The men eventually moved the cabin off of its foundation so that searchers could dig underneath. Even after a thorough search, nothing was found. The searchers shifted their attention to the property, now looking for any disturbed soil, any graves, or any hiding spots that could house a body. The men probed the loose soil of the orchard. They felt something buried underneath. They dug down and discovered the body of Dr. William York. He was identified by the clothing and personal effects on his body. His skull had been crushed on the right side, and his throat was slit. The bodies that were found in 1871 and 1872 had the exact same wounds. They were killed the same way as Dr. York. He had been buried face down in a shallow grave. The searchers continued by probing the orchard. They believed that they had found 9 more bodies, but waited until daylight to dig them up. 8 more bodies were found in the orchard the next morning. Another body was found dumped down the well, along with numerous other body parts. Every victim had their throat cut and their head split by a hammer. George Longcore and his infant daughter, Mary Ann, were among the victims. The young girl was the only victim that had no injuries. It was suspected that she was either strangled or buried alive. She may have possibly been kept alive even after her father had been killed, and then killed sometime later. The Benders were a serial killer family, long before the term serial killer had ever been used. They were sick, akin to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre family, the Sawyers. The investigators found a prayer book inside the cabin. Handwritten notes written in German were found and translated. They read, Joanna Bender, born July 30th, 1848. John Gebhardt came to America on July 1st, the rest is uneligible. Big Slaughter Day, January 8th, and Hell departed. It was believed that the Benders used Kate to lure in the victims and give them a sense of security. Kate was a beautiful young petite woman. She would have their guests sit with their back to the canvas wagon cover that separated the family's living area. She would feed the victims and converse with them or give them spiritual readings. While Kate was distracting them, Pa Bender or John Jr. would sneak up behind them and hit them on the right side of the head with a hammer. Then, either Kate or Elmira would slit the victim's throat. All this was done either over the trapdoor or next to it, so that the body could easily be dropped through the door until it was safe to check the body for valuables and then bury the victim in the orchard. It is believed that the Benders chose the location in Kansas specifically for its remote location next to the trail. Travelers were often going through the route and did not have ties to the area. The first body was found just a short time after the Benders moved in. There is no way to know exactly how many victims they had killed and disposed of, since their first victims were found away from the property. A number of survivors came forward and explained how they escaped death. In 1873, William Pickering was passing through Labette County, Kansas, when he stopped at the Bender Inn. At that time, the Bender family were already under suspicion for disappearances of several travelers. He claimed that he was first greeted by Kate. She started to chat with him and then invited him to stay the night. He said that he was uneasy when he met the rest of the family. He was told to sit with his back to the canvas, but he refused when he noticed stains on it. He claimed that Kate Bender threatened him with a knife, and then he was able to escape. A Catholic priest claimed that he stayed at the inn, and after talking with Kate at the table and being served supper, he turned to find one of the male Benders standing behind him holding a hammer. He surprised the man, but he managed to escape. This claim was never verified. A Mrs. Fitz described being at the table eating dinner when she heard shuffling behind her. Kate said something to the person behind the canvas, but Mrs. Fitz fled before anything foul could happen. Two men were at the cabin together to see Kate's spiritual powers. They refused to sit at the table. They claimed Kate became very angry with them. Pa Bender and John Bender came out from behind the canvas. The two men decided to leave after this encounter. During the investigation, a large amount of bullet holes were found in the walls and in the roof of the Bender Inn. The newspapers claimed that they were from victims who had survived the initial blow to the head, who managed to get a few shots off before eventually being killed. The Benders would steal any money or valuables from their victims. They even sold some of the victims' clothing and other valuables inside their shop, claiming that travelers who didn't have any money had traded the items for a safe place to stay. The Benders' wagon was found abandoned 12 miles from the inn. The horses were starving to death. Investigators had followed the wagon tracks. They also found out the Benders had bought tickets to Humboldt, Kansas on the Leavenworth, Lawrence, and Galveston Railroad. It's reported that John Jr. and Kate got off at Chanute, Kansas, and boarded the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad, headed to Denison, Texas. From there, they went to a camp near the New Mexico border. Pa and Elmira Bender continued on the train to Kansas City, and then headed to St. Louis, Missouri. A $3,000 reward was put up. Many claimed to have killed the Benders, but no one produced evidence sufficient enough to collect the reward money. It was discovered that the Benders weren't a family. The only two that were even related were Elmira and Kate. They were mother and daughter. Pa Bender was not Kate's father, and John Jr. was not Kate's brother. In 1889, almost 16 years after the Benders fled, two women were arrested in Michigan on a tip that they were the fugitives, Elvira Bender and her daughter Kate Bender. The women named Elmira Monroe and Sarah Eliza Davis. The two women were extradited to Kansas. There they were charged with the Bender murders. Several witnesses came forward. The witnesses gave conflicting testimony, some insisting that Monroe and Davis were the Bender women. Others were not so sure. After the initial media excitement and weeks of testimony, the case against the women failed due to lack of evidence. Monroe and Davis were released. There are conflicting totals on the numbers of victims killed by the Benders. It's believed to be between 13 and 20. Here are the names of the known victims. A Mr. Jones, whose body was found in Drum Creek. Johnny Boyle, found in the well. Ben Brown, found in the orchard, along with W.F. McGrady, Henry McKenzie, George Newton Longcore and his daughter Mary Ann, John Greery, Red Smith, Abigail Roberts, Dr. William York. 2 unidentified men were also found in 1872 with the same injuries. A number of body parts were also found that did not belong to any of the other victims. No one was ever convicted of the Bender murders. Officially, they all successfully escaped and escaped from justice. There are some claims about the identity of the Benders, but none can be confirmed. The Bloody Benders were the first family of serial killers in the United States. H.H. Holmes is often considered the first serial killer in America, but the Benders were killing by 1871 or earlier. I want to thank you all for watching this episode, folks. I hope you enjoyed, and we will see you on the next. Peace.